We'll be looking at chapters 5 and 6 tonight. The two main things that are going to occur in these chapters are David becomes king over all of Israel, and then he's going to bring the ark to Jerusalem. So let's read along, and I'll make some comments as we go. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 1 is a memory verse. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David and to Hebron, and spake, saying, We are bone by bone, and thy flesh. And then the next memory verse is 2 Samuel 6 and verse 2. And David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baalah of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, that dwelleth between the cherubims. Now let's begin in 2 Samuel 5 and verse 1. Then came all the tribes to David and to Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Thy bone and thy flesh. Reminds me of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. When it says, she is of my flesh. She was made of his bone. And so they're associating David. We're all one family now. And Israel was a family. It goes back to the man Israel, Jacob, and all his descendants. And so they're claiming now the kinship with David, all of Israel, coming to Hebron, where David has been ruling. Also, they said in times past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that leadest out and broughtest in Israel. David was somewhat of a captain in Saul's army, and they recognized that. It says, And the Lord said unto thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be captain over Israel. Those northern tribes, for those 7.5 years, they were under the rule of Ishbosheth, but they knew all along that David was to be their king. And so he says, Thou shalt feed my people Israel. That's an interesting word, feed. You could translate that shepherd. And some of the translations do that. As David had been a shepherd over the sheep, so now he'd be a shepherd over Israel. I'm reminded of what Paul told the elders at Ephesus, to feed the flock of God, over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers. In the New Testament, that's the word pastor. It's the word shepherd. And so to feed doesn't just mean to provide food, but it means to look after them. And so David, as he had been the shepherd of the sheep, would be a shepherd over Israel, and a prince, giving him then civil authority and civil power. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Now, I'll remind you, when David was out watching those sheep, Samuel had come to Bethlehem in the house of Jesse, and had already anointed David to be king. And then when David came to Hebron after Saul's death, the men of Judah came to Hebron and anointed him to be their king. And now all of Israel comes, and they again, for the third time now, David is anointed king. Somewhat of a ceremony, but it's showing that they're accepting David now as king over all of Israel, just as Samuel had said he would be. That was the official anointing, and these others sort of a ceremonial anointing to make him king. Now David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. That means David didn't live to be but 70. Well, I guess 70 was an old age in those days, but it doesn't seem all that old to me, and not near the age of the patriarchs that had gone before him. That 40 years is divided into two sections, where in Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all of Israel and Judah. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites. Now, we'd already read about Jerusalem in the book of Joshua, if you'd been reading through the Bible, and Jerusalem was occupied by the Ammonites. And the men of Joshua took Jerusalem, but they must have abandoned it and let the Jebusites come in. The old city had been called Salem. But now with the Jebusites occupying Salem, it was Jebus Salem, which becomes shortened then to Jerusalem. And so that's how it got its name. And so these Jebusites were living in Jerusalem, the inhabitants of the land, and they felt secure up there in the hills, in their city, their fortress that they had in those hills. And they said to David, except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in thither, thinking David cannot come in thither. They felt so secure and safe in their fort up in those hills that they said, why, the blind and the lame could defend this city. Well, we're going to read several times about the blind and the lame here. It said, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David. Now that word, the city of David, you might think it will apply to Bethlehem, where David had been born. But the city of David is Jerusalem. And this is the first time we read that Jerusalem is called Zion. Now you can look it up yourself. I saw where Mount Hermon up north of the Sea of Galilee was called Zion in one place. And we don't really know what the name Zion means, but Hebron is the most prominent, not Hebron, Hermon. Mount Hermon is the most prominent peak in those mountains north of Galilee. And so calling Jerusalem Zion may be referring to it as the most prominent hill that is up there. This is the important hill, Zion. Zion's going to take on some very religious significance as the temple is going to be built on Zion. And then later the church itself is going to be referred to as Zion several places in prophecy and a few times in the New Testament. And Zion is sometimes spelt with a Z, sometimes spelt with an S. But it's the same place. And this is the first time that hill is identified as Zion in the Old Testament. So the city of David in Zion. David said on that day, whosoever getteth up to the gutter and smiteth the Jebusites and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the city. Well, they took the city, and it was David's fort. And that's why Jerusalem was important to David. It was a well-defended place. David thought he could defend himself there. So it was a military city. David dwelt in the fort and called the city of David, and David built round about from Milo and inward. Well, we're not sure what Milo refers to. It's called Milo. Other translations have different things. Seem to be some kind of fortification, maybe an outer wall or something around Jerusalem building in. Now I want you to notice they went up the gutter. Now I've got a gutter on the side of my house, and I have heard of people climbing up a gutter to get up on the roof. That's not the kind of gutter we're talking about. And actually, the translators are a little ambiguous about what this gutter is. But there was an archaeologist by the name of Warren that was poking around Jerusalem, and he found a shaft that today is called Warren's Shaft. And it's a vertical shaft. It goes straight up through the rock. I found an illustration of it here. You've heard of Hezekiah's tunnel. Well, that comes later when Hezekiah builds a tunnel to the spring of Gihon so they can have water in Jerusalem when Jerusalem's under siege. Going through Hezekiah's tunnel, Warren found this vertical shaft that goes straight up out of Hezekiah's tunnel. And it is thought by many that this might be the gutter they're talking about here. It looked like maybe they felt so secure that they didn't think to watch their gutter. They didn't watch their well. They didn't watch their cistern. And David said, whoever gets up the gutter and takes Jerusalem can be the chief captain of the army. Well, it tells us in the account in the book of Chronicles that it was Joab that went up that shaft and led his men up that gutter. Now, I wish you had the picture so you could imagine those men crawling up through that narrow shaft, trying to position themselves straight up through that shaft, and then coming into the city unknown to the Jebusites until it was too many of them there and too late, and they were able to take that city. And that became the city of David. Well, David went on and grew great, and the Lord of hosts was with him. And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons, and they built David a house. We're going to read more about Hiram when we come to Solomon, because Hiram's going to help Solomon build the temple. May not be the same Hiram. This may have been Hiram and Hiram Jr., another king Hiram there in Tyre, but about this same time, up there near Tyre were the cedars of Lebanon. And I don't want you to think about these old cedars that we'll cut down and use for fence posts. These are mighty trees. You might think of them more on the order of the sequoias that we have in America. These were mighty trees in Lebanon. And Hiram, with that great forest behind him, was sending his men up to harvest those trees, and he's sending carpenters and making a league with David, and later he would be in league with Solomon and helping build David's house and Solomon's house and the temple there in Jerusalem. In verse 12, David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for his people's Israel's sake. David understood this wasn't just me that did this. And David had been patient from the time he'd anointed king. He would not take the life of King Saul to become a king, and he did not exert himself in Hebron, but he let events transpire until he became king by the events that took place, and acknowledged that to the Lord's doing, that he is now king in Jerusalem. But then we read in chapter 13, David took more concubines and wives, as though he didn't have enough already. And he had more sons out of Jerusalem. I wish you could have heard Georgia this morning in class. I said, I was going to get Mike. I said, Mike, why don't you read those names? And Georgia says, I want to read them. And so Georgia read through these names, and she probably went through them. Well, Lillian took turns reading through those names. Probably did better than I'm going to do right now, but let me try to read those names. After he was come from Hebron, there were yet sons and daughters born to David, and these are the names of those that were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, and Shobab, and Nathan, and Solomon, and Ibhar also, and Elishua, and Nepheg, and Japhia, and Elishama, and Eliadad, and Eliphalet. Of course, they called that elephant. They figured that little boy must have had big ears or something. They called him elephant, okay? But all of these names I've got circled in my Bible: Nathan and Solomon. Now, this is not the prophet Nathan. There is a prophet Nathan in David's day. You know, there was a time when people would name their children after preachers. You may know some. I know some folks who's named after preachers. Foy Rigney is named after Foy Wallace Sr., not the junior, but the senior, Foy Rigney. That preaches down at Mount View over in Coffee County. And some of you may know Foy. Well, David may have done that. I like to think David may have named his son after the prophet Nathan. And the reason Nathan is significant, you go to the book of Luke, and it's got the genealogy from Jesus all the way back to Adam. And it goes just before you get to David, you have Nathan. And so this is his genealogy in accordance to the flesh, coming through Mary. And evidently Mary then is a descendant of this son Nathan. Solomon is another son, and he became king. And there's a line of kings that come from Solomon that we read about. And in Matthew chapter 1, beginning with Abraham and going down to Christ, we read those line of kings with Solomon. And so from Solomon, Jesus is legal heir to the throne of David. It's through Mary that Jesus is of the flesh of David. And here's where that division takes place between Nathan and Solomon. Now, the Philistines heard about this. When the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over Israel, all the Philistines came up to seek David, and David heard of it and went down to the hold. Sounds like David hid out when he first heard the Philistines gathered their armies to him. And the Philistines came also and spread themselves in the vale of Rephaim. Let me see if this one worked. This one worked. That arrow is pointing to Jerusalem. The circle is around the words the valley of Rephaim. And so that would be the valley from Jerusalem going toward the Mediterranean Sea. And so the Philistines have gathered there, and they're going to approach Jerusalem by this valley, and they're going to try to put a stop to this kingdom that David is established here. And so David did the right thing. He inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I doubtless will deliver the Philistines into thy hand. I want you to notice, David inquired of the Lord. Starts off, that's what David does. He inquires of the Lord. If he had continued to inquire of the Lord through his reign, things would have gone so much better. He did at the beginning. The Lord said, go up against the Philistines. Well, he did. David came to Baal Perazim, and David smote them there and said, the Lord hath broken forth upon my enemies before me as the breach of waters. Therefore he called the name of that place Baal Perazim. And there they left their images, and David and his men burned them. These Philistines came up with all their little lucky charms, just kind of like everyone had their rabbit's foot. But this was some kind of image to some little god they was carrying with them. And buddy, David broke forth upon them just like bursting through the water. Kind of like when you see a ball team, they're going to run the ball right up the middle. Well, that's what David did. And they dropped their little lucky charms and ran from David, and he smote them. And then they went over that battlefield and gathered up all those little images and burned them. That shows so much for those Philistine gods. But the Philistines tried again. Philistines came up yet again and spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. This time they're ready for David. You try that again, David, and we've got you. And David went and inquired of the Lord, and he said, thou shalt not go up, but fetch your compass behind them, and come upon them over against the mulberry trees. And let it be, when thou hearest the sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees, that then thou shalt bestir thyself, for then shall the Lord go out before thee to smite the host of the Philistines. Well, this time David didn't hit them right down the middle. He crept on up behind them and hid out in the mulberry trees, and then waited for the signal. And there was a sound of a going in the top of the mulberry trees. What was that? Was that the blackbirds leaving? You've probably been under trees when the blackbirds left and you heard the sound of them going. Or maybe it was the wind blowing through the trees and they heard the wind and said, there's the sound, it's time to go. But the commentators tell us that this would have been the sound of an army marching forth, that they would have heard in the tops of the mulberry trees. And it does say that the Lord went out before thee to smite the host of the Philistines. The Lord and his angels going out before And then David following in this battle against the Philistines, slipping up behind them from the mulberry trees. And David did so as the Lord commanded him, and smote the Philistines from Geba until thou comest unto Gazer. In other words, he drove them way away from those valleys back to their cities that were back along the coast. And so David is now king over all Israel in Jerusalem, and established himself as king, and recognized by the Philistines and the other nations round about that you better be careful before you mess with David and his kingdom. 2 Samuel 6. Now that David is king, and this is the civil capital and the military capital, David wants Jerusalem to be the religious capital of Israel as well. And so again, David gathered together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And with his army gathered around him, it says, and David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baal of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts that dwelleth between the cherubims. The cherubims, if you remember the ark, it's a box. All right, see this box. Pretend like here's a box. And there was a mercy seat over the box. And in the ark was the law, the Ten Commandments. The symbolism of the mercy covering the commandments, covering the law. Isn't that interesting? Now on either side of the ark, they had made images according to God's command. Moses had his craftsmen make images of angels. And we read that they desired to look into those things that were hidden. You remember that in the book of 1 Peter? Well, there were these angels looking down into that mercy seat, and their wings came out, and they touched each other over the mercy seat. That's the cherubims that we're talking about there, guarding the ark. And it was there the high priest would go into the most holy place, and there would be what the Hebrews would call a Shekinah. The Old Testament calls it a glory. It was a shining light that would appear over that mercy seat underneath the cover of those angels once a year, and the high priest would go into the most holy place. It was the ark of the Lord. That's what it was. Called by that name because of the Lord's name. So they set the ark of God upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah, and Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drave the new cart. Did you see what's missing? It does not say that David inquired of the Lord. He should have. If he had, he would have known not to try to transport the ark on a new cart. You might remember the Philistines had put the ark on an ox cart and sent the ark back to Israel. And that's where David's picking this up, where that ark had come back. And David got a new cart. I bet he had that thing special built just for that ark. And probably with all good intentions, said, we're not going to get a regular old cart. We're going to make a new cart just for this purpose. And they tried to transport the ark on a cart. The law of Moses had said it was the priest that transport the ark. They would run staves through the rings and carry it on their shoulders. And David's trying to do this with a new cart. And he is really poured into this thing. And it's kind of like they're having a parade carrying that ark to Jerusalem. They brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps and on psalteries and on timbrels and on cornets and on cymbals. Now, this is the first time we read about instruments being used in association with the temple and the ark, and in a manner that might call a worship of God. And it's at a time when they're not paying too close attention to the law, isn't it? Now, I know later we see that God had David use instruments of music in the worship, and God regulated that, but sometimes it's pointed out here, the first time we read about these instruments, they're kind of taking matters into their own hands here. And then it says, David in verse 6, when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put forth his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. There was a bump in the road. And Uzzah, he may have had all good intentions, but it was irreverent. Because the law had said, you don't touch that ark. And Uzzah touched it anyway. And they weren't paying too close attention to the way God would have things done. And it sounds like God had enough of it now. And it says here, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him therefore as Zerah, and he died before the ark of God. You don't touch the ark. David was displeased, because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah, and he called the name of that place Perez Uzzah unto this day. David didn't like it. But then his displeasure toward God turned to fear, from anger to fear. And it says David was afraid of the Lord that day, and said, how shall the ark of the Lord come to me? Say, he should have already asked that question. If he'd asked that question to begin with, none of this would have happened. And the old law tells us how to move the ark. You don't need a new cart. Get those staves and get the priest and the sons of Levi to carry that ark. And David doing his own way and not being careful to follow what the Lord had said had caused this tragedy to occur. Well, David would not move the ark of the Lord unto him in the city of David. David carried it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And Obed-Edom must have realized this is God's ark and showed great respect for what was in his house. It says the ark of the Lord continued in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his household. And it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that pertaineth unto him, because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And this time they did it right. We read that it was so when they that bare the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces. Now that'd be the Levites and the priests. They use those staves. They carry 6 steps. We're going to stop and we're going to make a sacrifice. And they're showing great reverence toward God now. He sacrificed oxen and fatlings. He didn't have oxen pulling the ark. He sacrificed the oxen. And David was so joyful, he danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was girded with a linen ephod. And David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of a trumpet. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. She probably didn't think that's the way a king ought to act. I can just imagine her saying, my daddy Saul wouldn't have behaved like that, and thought David was getting too exuberant here, and all this dancing around in this linen ephod. What? That's not the way a king ought to present himself before the people. And she despised David. Now you remember Michal and David, they hadn't had such a good marriage to begin with. And it's going to boil over now. Well, they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. Now, this isn't the tabernacle of meeting and the tabernacle with the holy place. This is a special tent David had erected to keep the ark in. David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. As soon as David made an end of offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And it must have been quite a party and quite a reception. He dwelt among the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel. David's right out there with all the people, as well to the women as men, and gave everyone a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. You took bread and a piece of wine. That sounds like he gave them all a sandwich, doesn't it? He gave them some meat, and he gave them some bread, and he gave them a drink, a flagon of wine. And there were a lot of people. There were 30,000 men. That must have been a great multitude that he sent home with a lunch there to carry them on as they departed. I can just imagine them handing it out, as everyone's leaving. Now here's your provision. And all the people departed, every one to his own house. And now David comes home. He's so proud of himself. And he's ready to rejoice in his house. And he walks in, and there's Michal. I can just imagine the look on her face, can't you? Here's what happens. David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel this day." Now that could have been said real nice, but she must have said it very sarcastically. And then she went on to say, "Who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself." Now, I don't know how bad David did that. He had on a linen ephod, which is kind of an undergarment from the outer garments there. And how much did he uncover himself? I don't know. But Michal didn't like it. And she thought David had acted like a fool. And so David had some words back to her. What we're looking at here is a family spat. So David says to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me before thy father." You see how pointed that is? She probably thinking, "Boy, my daddy Saul would never behave like..." Well, he chose me before your father and before all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will play before the Lord. And then David kind of gets sarcastic too. He throws words right back in her teeth. He says, "I will be yet more vile than thus." So you think that was you just wait. I'll be more vile than that, and I will be base in my own sight. But then he said, "The maidens who thou hast spoken of will have me in honor." Well, they're having quite a spat, and it doesn't come out good. Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death. You might have thought that, boy, a child of David and of Saul's daughter would be a descendant both of King Saul and King David. What a king that would be. But that's over. Husbands and wives having a spat and never getting past it. And that's what happened with David. It's not just what she said. You behaved yourself gloriously before Israel today. It's not just what she said. It must have been how she said it. And husbands and wives, we can learn from this, can't we? Sometimes it's not just what we say. It's how we say it, isn't it? It's how we say it. And so that ended that. And there is no descendant of Saul then that'll ever sit on the throne of David. I want to turn to 1 Chronicles 15, 12 through 15, because it's generally thought that it was the prophets that wrote Kings and the priests that wrote the Chronicles. And they include a detail here that the prophets didn't include, and it explains something that's important to us. It says, "Ye are chief of the fathers of the Levites." Ye are the chief. This is David talking. "Ye are the chief of the fathers of the Levites. Sanctify yourselves, both ye and your brethren, that ye may bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel into the place I have prepared for it. For because ye did it not at first, the Lord our God made a breach on us, For that we sought him not after the due order. What's that mean? We'll keep reading. So the priest and Levites sanctified themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel, and the children of the Levites bear the ark of God upon their shoulders with the staves thereon, as Moses commanded according to the word of the Lord. They didn't do that the first time, not after the due order. If we're going to do God's things, we need to do God's things God's way. We need to worship God after the due order. Well, how do we know what to do? Well, we know what they did. They did according to the commandment of Moses and according to the word of the Lord. And what we need to do is according to that which is authorized by the apostles of Christ in the word of the Lord. It's not for us to invent ourselves instruments and to make our worship what we want it to be and to turn it into a big party and a big parade and put it on a new cart. That might all sound good to men. But what's the commandment of the Lord? You see, if we want to be the church of Christ, we're going to do the things of Christ by the authority of Christ and in accordance with the word of Christ. And that's what sets the church of Christ apart. It's that attention to the word of the Lord and doing things after the due order. Well, with that, I'm going to extend the invitation. If you need to be baptized into Christ, you have an opportunity to do that tonight. And if you've drifted away from the Lord, you have an opportunity to confess before your brothers and sisters, and we'll go to God in prayer for forgiveness of your sin. And if you need to respond to the invitation, then do it while we stand and sing.